with President Trump taking direct aim at our economy. His goal is to take every single business out of our country, out of our province, and bring it down to the U.S. But I'll tell you, I will fight like I've never fought before, and we're going to continue fighting against President Trump and his radical views.
Industry, businesses, Canadians, they are anxious and they are concerned. They don't deserve the uncertainty that's been thrust upon them. They don't like it. They like resolution, but they'd also like they want the right kind of resolution. They want a deal that makes sense for Canada, that makes sense for Canadian business, for Canadian workers.
Canada stands at a strategic crossroads, its nickel industry both a shield and a sword in the escalating trade tensions with the United States.
Let's make no mistake about it, as I mentioned to the Prime Minister, the rest of the premiers, we need to be ready. We need to be ready to fight.
With 90% of the world's high-grade nickel reserves under Canadian control, the resource has long been a lifeline to the U.S., supplying over a third of America's annual nickel demand. Yet, President-elect Donald Trump's threat of a 25% tariff on Canadian imports has transformed this lifeline into a bargaining chip.
This latest threat from U.S. President Donald Trump comes just 10 days from the deadline that the Canadian government was working towards to sign a new trade deal with the U.S.
And Canada, under the watchful economic eye of Mark Carney, is poised to play it masterfully. Trump's tariff threat is designed as a show of power, but in the chessboard of trade, Canada holds a piece the U.S. cannot afford to lose.
U.S. President Donald Trump intensified his trade war with Canada a day ahead of his August 1st deadline for a tariff agreement. In a Truth Social post late on Wednesday, Trump expressed surprise over Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney announcing that Canada plans to recognize the State of Palestine at the UN in September, and said, quote, "That will make it very hard for us to make a trade deal with them."
The U.S. has no domestic nickel production to fall back on. Every ton of nickel flowing from Sudbury or Voisey's Bay to American manufacturers keeps alive the engines of the aerospace, defense, and EV battery industries. Disrupt that, and you don't just bruise an industry. You threaten the integrity of a supply chain vital to national security. Carney, with his deep understanding of global finance, recognizes the leverage. Rather than reacting in panic, Canada signals control. Export quotas are quietly discussed, echoing historic moves when Canada restricted nickel shipments to block sales to adversaries. These measures aren't just about market balance, they're a calculated message. Canada will not be strong-armed, and it will secure the future of its industry, even if the U.S. market falters. Trump's approach risks creating economic tremors not just across Canada, but within his own borders. Nickel-intensive industries in the U.S. cannot pivot quickly. Alternative suppliers, whether from Indonesia, Russia, or China, cannot match Canadian purity or reliability. Any disruption will create cost spikes, delays, and potentially shuttered assembly lines. The political consequences could be as severe as the economic ones, with layoffs rippling across key manufacturing states. Carney's strategy is twofold: protect Canadian economic stability while subtly pushing the U.S. to reconsider its stance. By preparing to impose quotas and diverting surplus nickel toward allied markets in Europe and Asia, Canada ensures that the resource continues to work in its favor. These moves reinforce the idea that Canadian economic policy isn't reactive. It's adaptive and forward-looking. In Ottawa, the message is clear: tariffs won't sink the nickel industry, they'll accelerate diversification. Canada has already been expanding its downstream capacity, investing in battery-grade nickel processing facilities to capture more value domestically. Such moves align with global shifts toward electrification, where demand for nickel is set to surge. The U.S., meanwhile, risks isolating itself from a secure supply of a strategic material just as the EV race intensifies. The domestic political calculus in Canada is equally important. For Ontario, home to key nickel operations, Trump's threat is more than an economic irritant, it's a call to action. Premier Doug Ford has warned that Ontario could halt nickel shipments to the U.S. altogether if tariffs proceed. While such a move would hurt in the short term, it could solidify Canada's position as a sovereign economic actor, unwilling to fold under external pressure. The potential shutdown of U.S.-bound shipments would send shockwaves through American industry, forcing a reassessment in Washington. Job markets are at the heart of this standoff. In the U.S., tariffs could backfire dramatically. Higher input costs would make American manufacturers less competitive globally, potentially leading to plant closures and layoffs. In Canada, Carney's strategic handling aims to prevent a similar collapse by protecting the sector through market diversification and government-backed investment in new processing capacity. Trump's tariff threats, intended to strengthen American industry, may instead create a vulnerability that Canada can exploit. Carney's financial acumen and Ottawa's calculated diplomacy ensure that Canada is not cornered. Instead, the nation positions itself as a dependable supplier to those willing to engage on equitable terms, while holding its leverage firmly in reserve for future negotiations. The reality is stark. The US needs Canadian nickel more than Canada needs the US market. Tariffs risk severing a decades-old trade artery, forcing American manufacturers into higher-cost, less reliable supply arrangements. Canada, meanwhile, has the flexibility to redirect its resources, strengthen its alliances, and build long-term resilience into its economy. In this unfolding drama, Canada's strategy is not just about nickel, it's about asserting a broader principle of economic sovereignty. Trump's threats may have been designed to intimidate, but in Carney's steady hands, they become an opportunity to secure a better future for Canada's resource industries. The message to the world is unmistakable. Canada will not be dictated to, it will negotiate from strength. The potential fallout in the US job market is not a bluff. Should tariffs proceed, shuttered facilities in Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania could quickly become a political liability. Canada's calibrated pressure leverages this reality, creating incentives for American policymakers to step back from the brink. For Canada, the goal is not to damage the US economy. It's to ensure that Canadian interests are respected and that its industries are not collateral damage in a political fight. As the tariff clock ticks, Canada prepares for multiple scenarios. Expanded partnerships with European EV manufacturers, increased exports to Asia, and potential domestic stockpiling are all on the table. Carney's vision goes beyond immediate survival. It's about turning a threat into an inflection point that strengthens Canada's long-term economic foundation. Trump's rhetoric may dominate headlines, but Canada's actions will shape the outcome. By combining strategic restraint with economic diversification, Canada demonstrates that it is not a passive actor in this trade dispute. The nickel industry, long a symbol of Canada's resource wealth, becomes the centerpiece of a modern strategy that blends economic resilience with geopolitical leverage. In the end, tariffs may never be implemented. The risk to US industry, jobs, and security may be too great, but if they are, Canada will be ready. Not as a victim, but as a calculated player, guided by Carney's steady hand, capable of turning economic pressure into opportunity. In a world where strategic resources define geopolitical strength, Canada's nickel is not just a commodity, it's a cornerstone of national power.